All right, this morning I'm gonna teach on, her name is listed as Anna in the New Testament, the Christmas prophetess, that's what I like to call her. But her name in Hebrew is actually Hannah. Anna is the Greek derivative, Hannah is the original Hebrew, and I want to call her Hannah. Not that Anna's not a beautiful name, but I just like Hannah, and it goes along with my study. And I have something that I'm going to show you, because we're going to start with half of the picture, and then I'm going to slowly reveal everything. And I wanted to have like a little, physical symbol of that. So it doesn't look like much, does it? It looks like a few little lines and squiggles and things. And if you think you know what it is, don't say. But it goes into what we're going to be talking about. I have to say, this is probably my favorite study I've got to do. I even enjoyed this more than Mary. I loved Mary, because Mary is very personal, very close to my heart. But I discovered some things about this woman that I just adore her. She's one of those people, she's on my list of people when I get to heaven. I just can't wait to meet her, because I think she would be a hoot and a half to meet. We are introduced to her in Luke 2, beginning verses 36 to 38, which isn't a lot, but based on some of the other women we've talked about, she gets 3 verses. That's more than Isaiah's wife got. So, and she has a name. So, there you go. I'm gonna read from the complete Jewish study Bible. Some of the words, the really Hebrew words, I'm just gonna sort of pronounce out the way I pronounce them, but just know that I know that it's not necessarily written that way in here. But so here we go. Luke 2, beginning verse 36. There was also a prophet named Hannah bat Penuel of the tribe of Asher. She was a very old woman. She had lived with her husband 7 years after her marriage, and had remained a widow ever since. Now she was 84. She never left the temple grounds, but worshipped there night and day, fasting and praying. She came by at that moment and began thanking God and speaking about the child to everyone who was waiting for Jerusalem to be liberated. Just a little bit of context. We are going to back up a little bit later in the study, but just very briefly, she is in the temple at the same time that Mary and Joseph are in there, and that Mary and Joseph have presented baby Jesus to Simeon, and that's when she walks in. And I didn't know this, but I love the meaning of the name Hannah. It has 3 meanings. It can mean favor, grace, or beautiful. And I think all 3 of those names, she exemplifies those. Some interesting things about her. We do know that she is the daughter of Penuel and is of the tribe of Asher, which is significant and unusual. Her father's name, Penuel, means face of God. I love that. Face of God. The daughter of the face of God is beautiful. She has grace and she is favored. I just love that. It says in the complete Jewish study Bible, it also says in the Amplified, I checked the Tree of Life when I came in here too, that most of the modern English translations all say that she was 84. However, there is an interesting little tradition according to Jewish culture, and I know Myra knows about this, where some theologians don't think so, and rabbis. They think that she was a widow for 84 years. So at the time she's in the temple, it's possible she wasn't 84. It's possible that her age, she could have been anywhere from 100 to 105. And I did check the King James Version, and that's the only English version that I read that kind of insinuates a little bit that you could read it that way, because it says that she was a widow of about 84 years.
Well, that seems like that's how long she was a widow.
Yeah.
It makes better sense.
I think it does too. I think the fact,
It doesn't say she was 84 years old.
Well, it says now she was 84. And then in the Complete Jewish Study Bible. And then in the Amplified and the Tree of Life, they all say she was 84. But when I was doing some online research, I came across several different Jewish websites, and they talked about that there was this Jewish tradition that believes that she was at least, she anywhere from 100 to 105, depending on when she was married.
If she was 84 is not great age. It says a great age.
That's true.
She was a great age. To me, that's 100 or more.
I agree.
Yeah.
I think it's I'll get into this a little bit more, but I think it's more miraculous that she was a widow for 84 years than if she had been a widow until the age of 84. Because that means she would have spent the better part of her life in the temple, worshiping, praising, fasting, living in complete devotion to the Lord. And I think that is just such a beautiful picture of a beautiful life and a life well spent. So there's that. It does say, when it talks about her being a widow, I did come across a reference to 1 Timothy 5:5, which is interesting and could offer some insight into what Hannah's life might have been like as a widow. I'm reading from the Amplified, 1 Timothy 5:5. Now a woman who is really a widow and has been left entirely alone without adequate income, trusts in God and continues in supplications and prayers night and day. It doesn't say in Luke that she was left completely without an income, but it doesn't say that she had children either. And I think you could interpret it that she probably didn't have much income. I think initially when I started studying, I imagined her being this woman who had some means and was able to do that. But then when I read that, I was like, I think it's a much more beautiful picture of her devotion to God if she didn't have means. Because she is fasting, worshiping, and praising God, and in that temple, and is dependent completely upon Him, and is trusting 100% that He is going to provide and take care of her. And it's also, I think it's more sacrificial if she doesn't have means and she's at that temple, because she is trusting God to take care of her need. And so much of our lives as Christian is sacrificial. It's trusting the Lord to take care of us. Stepping out in faith, not knowing. And I think that's a beautiful picture of what her life was like. I tried to find something. I don't know if Myra or Jack or Jeffrey, if you all have any insight on this. I do know that priests stayed at the temple. There were places where they stayed, either on the temple grounds, not in the temple proper, but on temple grounds, when they were in service. But I wasn't able to find anything that spoke of, other people who just were really devoted and wanted to be there all the time. If there was a place where they could stay too, I wasn't able to find anything out about that. I didn't know if y'all had anything about that. If you knew anything about that.
Eli and Samuel.
Well, but Eli was the high priest too, though, right? And Samuel had been dedicated to service.
I do remember studying about one of the women, Huldah.
So Huldah,
when I looked at Huldah, I saw a diagram of how the layout was back then, and there was areas like she lived in the school, which was like right outside the temple compound. So there were people that lived around there.
In the grounds, but not like the temple proper, right?
I don't know.
So, I don't know. I think it's interesting. She had to have lived very close by, or stayed somewhere very close by, to be there night and day, all the time. I mean, unless, there was a place for her to sleep or do something like that at the temple, I mean, she would, I don't think it would have been very far. But the more I started looking at her, and when I realized her name was Hannah, that made me want to go back into the Old Testament and look a little bit at that Hannah. And it's interesting. One of the things I found, and I know Hannah's already in the Old Testament, I'm sure she's already been covered, but I just wanted to hit on a few things, comparisons between the two Hannahs. The Talmud considers Samuel's mother, Hannah, in the Old Testament a prophetess, even though she's never given that title. She is considered a prophetess, and the prayer that she prays in 1 Samuel 2, verses 1 through 10, is included every year in the Rosh Hashanah first day service as an example of a successful petition to God. And she is held as, in Jewish tradition and culture of that time, and I think even in modern times, she is an example of what an exemplary Jewish woman was and could do, who was devoted to God. I think the Hannah in the New Testament, no less great, equally exemplary, because I find it fascinating that she was a widow. She was a widow more than she was married in her life. And that can be a scary prospect. I mean, it would be scary in this day and age. I can't imagine what it would have been like. The pressure, the social pressure she must have felt when she was a young widow. Well, you need to get married. You need to find somebody else, get married, have some babies. You'll be okay. And that's not what was stirring in her soul. That's not what she was led by the Lord to do. She was led to be devoted completely to the Lord, to not be married, to serve Him, for essentially for Him to be her husband. She, spiritually speaking, He became her husband. Mm-hmm. He was her provider. He was her protector. She lived with Him night and day. She was always in that temple. I think that's beautiful. That's such a beautiful picture of what we can do, as not just as women, but as Christians, if we truly devote ourselves to God. So what I did is I noticed when I read, there were just a few similarities between these two women's lives, and I wanted to point some of that out. I think it enriches Hannah in the New Testament. Both Hannahs in 1 Samuel and in Luke, they both had very difficult lives. We've talked about Hannah, the prophetess, how difficult her life was. A young widow. She only was married 7 years. The year of completion. Isn't that interesting? Her husband died. Possibly no children. I don't think she had children. I think if she would have had children, I think that would have more than likely been mentioned. I mean, because her father's name is mentioned, and the tribe she was associated with was mentioned, and that's highly unusual too. But Hannah in the Old Testament also had a hard life. She was the second wife of Elkanah. She was barren. His first wife, Peninnah, was not a nice lady. She had children. She constantly ridiculed and mocked, went out of her way to make Hannah's life miserable and unbearable. So they both had hard lives. But the reaction of both is I think interesting, because both devoted themselves to God through prayer in response to their difficulties. Hannah in the Old Testament is at the tabernacle up in Shiloh and goes and has had a session with the other wife and has basically just reached her breaking point. and is miserable and is in tears. And instead of sitting there feeling sorry for herself, she gets up and she goes to pray in the tabernacle. And Hannah prays for God to give her a son. And if God will give her a son, she swears a vow that she will give him to the Lord's service for all of his life. That's interesting, because Hannah in the New Testament, when we see her, she's praying, she's worshiping in the temple. She never left the temple grounds, but worshiped and fasted and prayed night and day. And it doesn't say that she swore a vow before God, but I think the way she lived her life and all those years, I think she had to. Even if she didn't say it, she lived a vow. She made a vow to God. Her life speaks of that. Both were richly blessed by God. Hannah in the Old Testament was blessed. She was blessed many ways. She was blessed, verbally blessed twice by Eli, the high priest, which was, I think, quite an honor to have the high priest himself give a verbal blessing of the Lord upon you. That would be amazing for a man, but I think for a woman, I think that's even more amazing and exceptional. So she was blessed by Eli. She was blessed by God. She had, in addition to Samuel, after she had weaned Samuel and took him back up to the tabernacle and left him and committed him to God's service, the Lord blessed her with 3 more sons and 2 more daughters. And on top of that, she was the mother of Samuel. Who was the last judge of Israel, the last judge from the book of Judges, but the first prophet to serve publicly in an office that you would call prophet, that is like a national prophet. He was the first to do that. We don't hear any more about Peninnah after it talks about her and her little bratty kids and how she makes Hannah's life miserable, but Hannah is remembered forever for that. Hannah in the New Testament is the only named woman, meaning not anonymous, the only woman who we know her name in the New Testament, a godly woman, to be given the title of prophetess. There are some anonymous prophetesses mentioned. Philip the deacon, he had 4 daughters that were prophetesses, but we don't know their names. Another blessing, Hannah's father's name and her tribe are also provided. And that's interesting, because in the scene that we're reading, we don't know any of that about Simeon. Nothing is given about him like that. And that's interesting. I think that says something about this woman and her devotion to God, that Luke, the human penman under divine inspiration by the Holy Spirit, felt led to list her father's name and her tribe. That's significant.
Precision.
Yes, it's precision, but I think it's also God's way of giving her a little bit of acknowledgement, giving her something that most other women aren't granted. That's something that, most women never had. And then the final thing that both Hannahs share is both have a very special connection to Messiah, or the Anointed One. Because in 1 Samuel, first chapter, we see Hannah's story. Second chapter, after she has Samuel, it gives her prayer of thanksgiving, where she's praising God. And Hannah is the first person, also a woman, in the Bible to use the word Messiah or the Anointed. Mm-hmm. Some scholars think that when she talks about the Anointed, they think she's talking about David. But the vast majority that I looked at say that it's Messiah. Dr. McGee also, in his Through the Bible in 1 Samuel, points that out too, that she is talking about the Messiah, and that this is the first use in the Old Testament of that specific word in conjunction with Jesus. interesting. In Luke 2, in verse 38, Hannah becomes the first named woman other than Mary, but the first woman outside of that family who is named to behold baby Jesus and recognize him publicly as the Messiah. Because she does. She came by at that moment and began thanking God and speaking about the child to everyone who was waiting for Jerusalem to be liberated. Who else but the Messiah is going to liberate Jerusalem? Nobody. That's what they were looking for. He was the liberator. He was the liberator of Jerusalem. He was the liberator of the nation. And so she has that moment where she not only gets to see him, but she recognizes, God gives her that moment of recognition in her spirit. This is the Messiah. And she tells everybody she sees about that. I think these women, I think in looking at Hannah in the Old Testament and seeing her and looking at Hannah in the New Testament, it helped me see her role as a prophetess. I think that's also, I haven't really talked about that, but that's a blessing too. The fact that she was a prophetess, the fact that God gave her that gift. I think it would be curious to know if that's a gift that she had had all her life, or if after her husband died, when she really dedicated herself, if that's when maybe she started to experience the manifestation, the full manifestation of that gift. I think that would be interesting. I also think it's interesting about her, the fact that she was married for 7 years. 7 is the number of completion. She was also probably 100, let's say 100 roughly, 100 to 105. 50 is the number of the year, that's the year of Jubilee, the 50th year. 50 is very significant. 50 is also the number, roughly a generation. So her lifespan, she saw 2 Jubilees. She saw 2 Jubilee periods. She saw 2 generations. Her husband was taken from her. She had no children. She had no other means. But it also says in Isaiah that the Lord gives us a double portion. And I think maybe her longevity of life, the fact that she was able to live to minimum age 100, she got a double portion. She got to see 2 Jubilees. How many people were lucky at that time to even get to live one complete and see one complete year of Jubilee? Fully. And she got to experience 2. I think that's pretty cool. What I'd like to do now is, well, let me get my little picture. Let me try to do this where I can. Okay, so we got a little bit more. We're going to show the picture. Again, if you think you know what's going on, just hold on. It's a little bit more of the picture. We've seen it. This is the part I love. We're getting to the good part now. I love the part with the 2 Hannahs, but this is shouting time for me. Okay. So I'm going to go to the 25th verse of Luke 2 and read up to verse 35. There was in Jerusalem a man named Shimon. This man was a tzaddik. He was devout. He eagerly waited for God to comfort Israel, and the Ruach HaKodesh was upon him. It had been revealed to him by the Ruach HaKodesh that he would not die before he had seen the Messiah of Adonai.
Where are you?
26.
26.
Luke 2.
Luke 2. Sorry.
2:26?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Prompted by the Spirit, he went into the temple courts, and when the parents brought in the child Yeshua to do for him what the Torah required, Shimon took him in his arms and made a bracha to God and said, Now, Adonai, according to your word, your servant is at peace as you let him go. For I have seen with my own eyes your Yeshua, or salvation, which you prepared in the presence of all peoples, a light that will bring revelation to the Gentiles and glory to your people Israel. Yeshua's father and mother were marveling at the things Shimon was saying about him. Shimon blessed them and said to the child's mother, Miriam, this child will cause many in Israel to fall and rise. He will become a sign whom people will speak against. Moreover, a sword will pierce your own heart too. All this will happen in order to reveal many people's inmost thoughts. Then I'm going to read this in conjunction with 36 to 38 again. There was also a prophet named Hannah bat Penuel of the tribe of Asher. She was a very old woman. She had lived with her husband 7 years after her marriage and remained a widow ever since. Now she was 84. She never left the temple grounds, but worshipped there night and day, fasting and praying. She came by at that moment and began thanking God and speaking about the child to everyone who was waiting for Yerusha. I'm just going to say Jerusalem to be liberated. So now I wanted to talk a little bit about Simeon, because I feel like you can't really you can't really get the full picture and significance of what Hannah's doing in this moment without at least giving a little time and attention to Simeon. Simeon is called a Zadik or Sadiq, which means righteous one, enlightened one. It's a title that's given of respect. In a lot of the modern English translations, it just says he was a righteous man, a just man, devout before God, but that really doesn't convey the significance of what he's being called. It was a title of respect and honor that he was given. He was a Sadiq. It's also a title that is used a lot with rabbis. And there, I saw something where there was a little sort of back and forth about that, but a rabbi is more like a doctor of theology, somebody that like has a prescribed list of things they have to complete, they have to do. You don't get necessarily a diploma, but you do get the title of rabbi. Sadiq is more like an honorary doctorate. It's something to acknowledge the contributions that you've made, how you've benefited society, how you've benefited the spiritual life of the people, is the best way I think of it. That's how I think of it. His name also means to hear, to be heard, and reputation. That's really cool, because he heard the voice of the Spirit speak within him and tell him he would not die until he had seen Yeshua Messiah. He had seen the Messiah and the salvation of his people. He was heard because he spoke to Mary and Joseph, and especially to Mary. They heard him, they heard those words, and were able, and what an honor that was. Because more than likely Simeon was a priest. That's what any sort of commentary or anything I looked at was all in agreement that he was a priest, because when they gave Jesus to him and put that baby in his hands, that was something you did with a priest. So he was a priest. Interesting. We don't know his father's name. We don't know what tribe he's from. That's interesting. But we have, it's almost like the roles have been reversed. We have this, he hears the Spirit. He knows that God has spoken to him and told him that he's not going to die until he sees his salvation. And he heard that voice and he believed in that and was devoted to that all of his life. And I think, it doesn't say how old he was, but I think he was probably, I'd say he and Anna were probably about the same age. She may have been a little bit older, but I'd say not by much. I'd say he was an old man too. He was a very old man. These two old people who had lived holy, devoted lives to God and to God's service, lived their whole lives for this one moment that maybe lasted 10 minutes at the most. And that was their moment of destiny. That was something they had waited their entire lives for. That's cool. That is awesome. And when you think about it, it teaches me, we look for those great moments, those moments that just, of greatness that last. But so often, true moments of greatness are just little teeny tiny bubbles of moments that just are very fleeting. And if you're fortunate and you're blessed by God, you get to fully experience that. And they got to come into the fullness of their purpose in life. I believe these two people, their purpose in life was to be at that temple when Mary and Joseph came, so they got to see baby Jesus. That's a life well spent. That's all you can say about your life. That you lived an upright, holy, devoted life to God. You got to see baby Jesus. You got to hold him. You got to see him. You got to look into that little face. Woo! That's amazing.
The amazing thing, or the big part also was he was led by the Spirit in verse 27.
Right.
So he came by the Spirit of himself. That means the Holy Spirit said, go. This man was walking in the Spirit.
Right.
Before, the Holy Spirit really, is falling on Christians later. This man was walking in the Spirit before that time. This man was walking in the Spirit.
I think it's awesome now that you mention that, because we're coming just out of the period of about 400 years where there had been no direct word from God. There had been no word sent by a prophet or anyone else. It's 400 years of silence. And what breaks that silence is an angel delivering news to an old man that he and his wife are going to have a baby. Then an angel delivers a message to a young teenage Jewish girl that she's going to have a baby, and she's going to be the mother of the Messiah. She's going to be a virgin. She goes to see that elderly lady, and when she enters into the room, the elderly lady's already pregnant, and the baby in her womb has a massive Holy Spirit reaction, and it's filled with the Holy Spirit. And anybody who may watch this on YouTube, that is one more example of how life truly begins at conception. That baby was alive. That baby had a soul. It was John the Baptist. He didn't just come to life when he was born. He wasn't a blob of flesh. He was a living, breathing being that the Holy Spirit filled before he had ever taken his first breath outside of his mother's body. I'll get off my soapbox.
It was Elizabeth.
I know.
Her cousin.
I know. And then you have the silence broken by those two babies being born. And then when Mary goes to the temple to complete her purification, which is kind of another strange thing too, because I read